So in this first video, we'll be starting with our roof profiles. So if we load up our reference here, there's a bunch of different ones, and you'll be able to build any of these using the techniques in this tutorial, but we'll start with this type of profile here. It has kind of like a wave shape where the end of it is kind of sitting and grappling onto the other one. So let's move on to substance. And we'll use this file that will be included. So this is just our starter file, so it sets up the viewport correctly. We will name this graph roof profile, and we'll save the whole graph as, let's see, we'll start a new folder in here. And we'll just call this roof. Actually, we should just name this guy roof main, because this will be our main graph where we build our roof, but we'll make a new substance and make an empty one, and we'll call this roof profile. And the empty graph has nothing in it, so we'll just need one output on here. So what we'll do in here is we'll start by, if we go back to our reference, just going to build this shape as we see it in X-ray from the front view. So we're just going to build a shape sort of like this. So we can start with a gradient here. Start with this gradient linear. And we'll run this through a histogram scan. And set this to 0.5 and 1. Just we need a super sharp mask like this. And then we will use another gradient. Gradient. We'll rotate this 90 degrees. So what we'll do with this, we're going to push this shape with that. But first we're going to run this through a curve node. And we want to just create something like this. So we have these two bulging shapes like this, and we'll just make them a little bit wider. And we'll select this midpoint here and make sure it's 0.5. So you click it down there. And also for this node here, we'll flatten those two. So the shape is now round and going in and up. Just adjust it down a tiny bit more. It's not going to matter too much here. And what we'll use this one with is we're going to use a directional warp. And then we're going to push this shape. Let's see here. Something like this. Now we can see I want these to be a little bit rounder, but now we have a good visualization on there. We should also set this one to not tile. We don't want this shape to be repeated down here. So we say no tiling. So we just have this curve here. So what I think is that we just extend these guys in so we get a little nicer curvature. 0.25 down there. We'll do the same on this side. Grab this little point, 0.75. That looks a little bit better. Maybe we can just expand this. I think that looks pretty good. Maybe we just want to grab these points a little bit more and make them a little more Yeah, that looks good. So let me just save. Just don't forget to save. And then we're going to run this edge detect to actually create this profile. So if we have these contrasting values here, we have black and white, this edge detect is going to pick that up perfectly. We're just going to invert this, and we're going to maybe do like pretty wide. 8 and 4 looks pretty good. We're going to run this through a transform here. Just going to set this to no tile. And we're going to scale it down a bit like this. And what I want to do here is extend it on each side. But first, if we go back to the reference, we see that it should end on a top ridge, not on the bottom like ours is doing. So we'll just put a transform here and move it off 0.25 down here. So now it's ending on a top instead of a bottom. And the same there. And to extend this a little bit on the corners, we're going to use a distance node. So we're going to use this as the source, and then we're going to put in a shape node here. And this guy we're just going to scale down. Let's blend these two together so we just see that they overlap. They just need to overlap slightly like this. That will work. This is for debugging here. I'm going to put this one in the mask. And you see what the distance is doing. It's where that mask is sitting. It's just going to extend those edge pixels. So we can set this to 15 or something. Maybe a little bit more. Now we can nuke this guy. Also we can, for optimization purposes, we don't need this to be a full 2K, so we can set this one back down to maybe a 256. And now this node is picking up that this is a 256, so we're going to double click this node and say relative to parent, which is the whole graph. So now this is back to 2K. Let's clean this up a bit. We select all these and we can go up here to this, snap to grid. Let's move them off a bit this way too. Okay, perfect. So now we have these kind of like faded values here. So we're just going to run this through a histogram scan. So we get that solid shape out there. And if we go back to the reference again, we will need to cut top and bottom a bit. So we'll reuse this shape and we'll cut this stuff out here. Put a blend, transform. We'll set this to absolute no tile. We'll subtract. And we'll just scale this guy down. And this node we can actually set to relative to parent as well, so we don't get that blurry. You can rotate it a bit too. And then we will clone these two. Copy and paste, Control C, Control V. The same here, we're just going to take this guy and move it down here. something like that. So now if two of these sit next to each other, they will overlap perfectly. I used a slightly different reference when I was building this offline before, but you could also just follow this and do exactly this. But for this example, I'm just going to build it like this. But feel free to do that. And here you see we have a lot of aliasing here, so we're just going to blur this. And we can use this cheaper blur. And we just set this to 1, just so we get a little bit fuzzy edge. Also, what I want to do here is create a little bit of an interior shape to this. So I'm going to run this through this guy through an edge detect. We can set this one to 4. Invert this. And we'll also blend these two together. Okay, just subtract this with a really low value on here. You see it just creates that little bit of a difference there. So this is the end of our initial profile. And what we'll do here is we're going to go into our main graph and we're just going to drag and drop our profile in here. So what's cool about this setup is that we now, later once we built our whole roof graph in here, we could just go into our profile and add, you know, as many profiles as we want in here and just expose those parameters to switch out what the graph looks like. You know, based on these references, we can now recreate all these and just have, you know, the whole graph just update with the new profile. There are a lot of ways of making tiles, obviously in Substance Designer, but based on my own research, I think this is by far the fastest. So we're going to use this new height extrude node. It's going to drop it down in here and drop our profile. And then we'll just use this little marker here or pointer and just rotate it around. So we're going to put it down here in the center. And then we're going to use these controls here to offset our tile so it's properly centered. We can play around with the height scale and camera scale, but essentially we just want to frame it in but still have a little bit of space on each side. Let me just dial that in here. And as you can see, these numbers here in the property window, this is the center point. So if I move this off to the side, it's going to start tilting. So we want to keep this one pretty straight in the center. That's too much. Yeah, 3 is probably good. And that's pretty much our first tile. There's a lot of different ways also to tile a bunch of these patterns out using many different nodes. The most common is the tile sampler, which has always been my go-to node. Let's see, 6 and 8. And then we can go in and offset some of the scales here. That pretty much gives you all you want right away. But the problem with this approach is we want to extract masks for every single one of these tiles. And using this node, we don't have good capabilities for that. So instead of using this, this node, we will use a semi-recently added node called a shape splatter. So if we instead hook this one up to pattern here, you see nothing happens. It's because this node requires a background height. So let's just add a Perlin noise. Set that to 5. So it's taking in this background and it's putting these patterns on top of that and on the relative height as the background texture. And let's set this to the same 6 and 8. Let's offset our scales here a bit. And we are going to flatten our, this one is a little too noisy, so you see it creates a lot of vertical change. Actually, we can delete this node. So let's use a histogram range and just compress. Compress this range down. And now you can see there, if you compare this to this, now they're behaving more or less like what's expected. Seems like they're not touching here, so we'll just expand this scale a bit more. 1.2, look. So compared to the tile sampler, this guy offers these output splatter data nodes. So if we search for shape splatter, you have all these here in line, and we're going to look at this data extract. So what you typically want to do for these type of materials, and if you look at some of our reference here, this one for instance, where the color is very different for each tile, and this one where you know, the lichen is different for each tile. It's not like it's the same pattern smearing over each and every tile. And here you see there's some difference in the amount of dirt. So what you want for that is a binary mask for each tile. So if we hook these two guys up to this, you see here, for instance, we have a unique grayscale value for each tile. It also offers like a bunch of other options here, but the one we're going to use in this tutorial is it's this position value here. I'm just going to do a grayscale conversion of this one, and then I'm going to run this through an edge detect. So essentially I want to create like a bunch of these different cells that we can use to add details, cracks, and different colors and different amounts of lichen or stuff like that. So let's move these guys up here. And we're going to run this through a flood fill node. And the flood fill node is a node that can create unique patterns for each, or unique data for each and every single element that's contained within a black and white mask, pretty much. So we're going to run this through flood fill a random color, which will allow us to get multiple values for each. There's also one called flood fill to random grayscale, which gives us one set of grayscale values, but actually using this one we get multiple. So if we run this through an RGBA split, you see we have 1, 2, 3, 4 different setups. But before running it through this, we're running it through a distance node. And a distance node will need a mask input. And what it'll do, it will fill out all these small gaps between here. So you see here we have gaps, and if we look at this node, you see it creates these gaps in between, but using the mask node as an input here, and the source input as this, it will shrink all those and create watertight masks. And we can set this to something higher. And we hook this one up to our RGBA split. Essentially now we have a bunch of different masks we can use later in the graph. So we'll start our shape by we'll just hook this one straight up to our, so if we just left click here, left click one time, and you see here now is our tiles. And we can play around with our scale settings and tessellation settings here. But what I want to do here is I want to run this through auto levels first. And you see this is a bit extreme. Also we have this crazy tearing here that we will try to remove first. Let's make this a little bit neater here. So I'm going to go to my directory where I have some extra files, and this file will be included. I've essentially created my own low passing node. And a low passing is essentially this node only takes your input and it blurs it in a bunch of different steps. Imagine I have a couple of blur nodes here in a row, and one is set to 1, and the next one is set to 2, 3, and 4, etc. And they just layer like this, and they blend back onto the main shape. So that's all this node is doing. This node is free and is available on my Gumroad as well, but it will be available as a download for this tutorial. So what I want to do here is I want to start by using this low pass node, and we'll add a few steps on here. I guess we can do the full. It's gonna eliminate some of this tearing. If we use this fade amount here, you can see this is without the node, and this is what the node is doing. So essentially rounding off all details. But the problem is here we're also pushing a little bit too far. So we're gonna put a blend node here and just crossfade these two. So we're splitting the difference. Just getting a little more range back, but not as much as the auto levels node wants to do. And let's put a frame around this output so we can continuously just move that out of the way as we build our graph. So coming back in here, we will add a bit of cracks on this. So we want to randomly put a little bit of surface cracking on some of these tiles. So we'll start with the tile random node, which is just a node that's just good at laying out a couple of different shapes. So we're going to swap these over to the disk, and we're just looking for a bit of a random pattern here. So we can tweak some of these random offsets. Let's make the scale a little bit smaller. We can crank up this this random offset, but we don't want them touching ideally, and that's what's good about this node, because it generally tries to avoid that. And we'll do maximum color random. You can put that down here. We'll do the same here. We'll run this through a distance node as well, because we want to create this just random cell pattern. And we'll hook it up to here, and then if you select this wire, you can do histogram scan. And we'll just crank that one up to max. And also set this one to something incredibly high. Essentially what this node is doing, it's just taking these input points and it's just growing them slowly. So if I set this one to 5, you see it takes this shape and it starts growing it until it hits a neighbor. And you see here it hit this neighbor, but you see it kind of has a shape to it. And by setting this to something crazy high like that, we just completely fill in that gap. And we'll run this through an edge detect. We want something small. We can have a little bit of roundness, and the roundness parameter is just controlling the roundness of the cell in the corners. We can have a little bit of corners. And we'll should probably have this 1. And we'll do a blur just to soften it a little bit. Because this one is pretty much 100% aliased, and we don't want that. We want something just a little bit softer. But we still want a good range in there. And let's add a slope blur node. And from before we have this Perlin noise node, so let's all move this guy up here. So we can keep all our noises as we make them up here for easy access. So let's put this one through a safe transform. Let's say 4. You can also do a 45-degree. It's a pretty noisy pattern, but it's perfect for what we want to use it for here, because you won't see this repetition inside this node. And you see this kind of went a bit crazy here, but we will dial this back. So first we crank up the samples, we set the mode to be min, and we just want to tear these apart like this. And what we do next here is we run this through a histogram scan. And we just create like a binary mask out of this. It has a little bit different line weight to it. And then we put this through a directional warp. And now it's the time to use one of these first patterns. So we can use this alpha one because it's the closest. And you see I just hooked it up to the intensity input here. And the distance or the intensity is 10, so you see we broke this connection here. So for each and one of these grayscale values, we're going to push this texture off. If you only do it a tiny bit, you will see that it's quite obvious still, but if you put this to, let's say 200, now we're completely breaking that repetition, and you can also play with the angle to offset it even more. So the final step for this is I'm going to run this through a bevel just so I get like a nice like angle to these small cuts. Something like that. This node is also notorious for creating this alias effect, but they have this smoothing in here. It's not super good, but I think this will do the trick for this. And what we'll do next is we'll just put a frame around this, just keeping ourselves organized. So we'll move it down a bit. And we just call this cracks. Just to remember what we're doing. And then up here, we'll just put a blend node in here. And here we'll just multiply this with something really low. Obviously now we have sort of cracks all over everything, and they might not be what we want. So we can use this same mask again. So if we hook this up here, but now there's a ton of grayscale values in here, so we just want to clamp this. So we'll use this histogram scan, and we only want cracks on these tiles. And depending on, you know, the look you're going for, you can try any one of these other masks. And to extract even more masks out of this, you could use a node called histogram select, where you can select, you know, the midpoint between the max and min position of these values. So this will be the max, the white, and this will be the min. So you can kind of select a range in between and shift that around to create even more different masks. Maybe we'll use this one for this. This is also a node later that we can control or expose, where you can have like cracking, and you can say amount, and all you will tweak is, you know, essentially this. So looking at some reference of tiles cracking, typically it seems like they crack, you know, vertically and not as much, you know, sideways. And that's something you totally can control now with this setup. So you can actually go in here and customize how you want these cracks to typically be laid out. So maybe this is something that works a little bit better. Maybe we'll leave it like this for now. And let's move on to just adding a tiny bit of surface damage to these tiles, or surface variation. So we will use, let's start by moving this stuff off again. So let's add a black and white spots 1 node. We can set this to, just to get a bunch more here, 3. We can leave it at the same sort of relative height as these guys. Yeah, and if you select multiple nodes and hit this guy, it will just align them on one line. So let's, if we look at this node, it's pretty cloudy looking, and we just want sort of more even damage or even noise. So we run these through this high pass node, and then we want to tighten that up a bit, so we run that through a histogram scan just to get more contrast. 0.4, 0.8 maybe. Get some kind of splotchy spots. And to further massage these, we can run them through this non-uniform blur. Just get a shape that kind of starts at the corner and gets more deep in the center. We can mess around with some of these other settings here as well, just to get a little bit of directionality in them. Here they seem heaviest at the bottom. You can see if we expand this even more. Crank these quality settings up to the max here at the bottom. And now you can see how you can sort of push the weight around inside these. Let's just leave it at 3 for now. And these we can just blend. Move this one back a bit. Let's use the subtract. But yeah, we want a really low value here. Maybe even lower. So we're going for a slightly older tile with a little more damage. I think something between this. Yeah, maybe something more like this thing here. I think that's my main goal with this first version here. But you see now it's kind of like blending all atop these surfaces, so we grab a different mask from here and we send that into a directional warp again, so we get different damage on each tile. And we'll crank the intensity up to something high. That looks pretty good, but it's too uniform all over again. So what we'll do here is we'll add a grunge map, which are these predefined noises that comes with Substance. So we can use this guy. We can blend him on top of this. Just to patch this up, so you see this is with the blend and this is without. And this one I'm fine with smearing on top of all the surfaces, since we're breaking it up here, but even if we would multiply this after it, that would be fine too. That looks a bit nicer, but we can play with the contrast settings on this. Can lower this contrast a bit more. Getting it a little more patchy. I think that looks pretty good. And we'll frame this as well. And we'll call this surface damage. So in the next step here, I want to add a little bit of grout. So if we look at a reference board again, these kind of older type of Italian tiles, they use this kind of cement or grout underneath. So we want to have some of that leaking out in between the tiles. So let's see how to build something like that. So starting our grout, we want to use this height blend node. So if we put this one in the bottom here, or actually in the top, we'll put our grout in the bottom. And let's add a moisture noise, which has this kind of like concrete-y look to it. We're lowering the opacity of it to just make it a bit more soft. So you see, if I blend it in like this, it shows up in some of these crevices, but I also want it to come in between these cracks as well. But the cool thing about the height blend node is that it has this output, which is the mask between the two layers. So we want to start by cranking up this contrast to 1, because you can tell the difference here. We want this mask to be sharp, because yeah, we'll have one color for our tile and we'll have a separate color for our grout here. Let's move this one off a bit. So what we can do here is we can start with we can run an edge detect actually from one of our noises here. And it will call out all the borders between our tiles. And this one we can blur. We can blend that in. And we just want to add it a tiny bit. And you see, even just with that, it starts calling out some of these edges and adding a bit more. But we can take this a bit further even. To add a bit more chaos to this, we can actually reuse our noise here from before. And we can run that through a non-uniform blur. Since our mask now is pretty sharp, we need to like blur it up a little bit, and we can use the default settings for this. And we can add these two together. And with something kind of low, add 0.1. And you see how it adds a bit more random to the overall. Since this is pretty flat and it's blending with our tiles here, it's going to by default just end up in these crevices here, but this with this shape on top here, we get this kind of bands of the grout kind of leaking out even more. So that's one thing we can do. Pretty happy with the detail noise here. You could go in and add even more detail to this, or if it's too much, you can lower the opacity of this. But you see, it's pretty touchy here. You start losing, all the shapes pretty quickly. Can even blur this one more to make it a little more natural looking and not so like kind of bubbly like that. And obviously if you get to a point where it's like I like how this looks, but it's just too much, and then we can go into our height blend and just push this back more. And this we can also go in and just comment. You can either, if you want to put a comment box around something, you can add a frame like this, or you can select something and do space frame. And this one we just call grab. Just two different ways of doing the same thing essentially. Pretty slim and nice graph so far. Let's build a little bit more into our grout here, a little more variation. So let's say we can expand our little mask here a bit. So let's use this shadows node. Essentially it just creates shadows based on a height input here. So we'll set the light direction here. And with these shadow distance, you can go way higher than just one. You can go way further than that. But let's leave it a bit like this. And if you mess with this softness, you can get these sharp lines. And you can either downsample or upsample this. So we're gonna probably leave it around here. Maybe mess with the direction a bit. So this one we'll need to invert. And just up the contrast with the histogram scan. It's too contrasty. We can get it a bit like this. All we're looking for here is just making it look a little bit more natural and a little more like dynamic. Can lower this contrast a bit more. And this one we can multiply with this old mask that we got from before, just to break up the perfect shapes. It's a bit hard to see what it's doing here, but essentially just messing with these perfect lines we created. And this one we can just add down to here. Yeah, looks pretty interesting. Play around with all the values we got here. Even, you know, the shadow length. We can try something kind of extreme like that, and we'll go in and crank up the contrast. There's no really right and wrong here. You just pay attention to what it looks like and if you like it or not. It looks alright, and if it's too much, you know, we can go in here in this add node and just put as much as we want of it. I think this looks pretty nice. When it comes to the tiles themselves, they look really orderly, so we can see in the next section here like how we can add a bit more chaos to this.